Welcome to my talk. Thank you very much for having me. I am really honored to be invited and to be on the stage. My name is Hugo Leo, and I am a taste researcher. I did my PhD research on computer models of taste at the MIT Media Lab. After that, I was chief scientist of a web startup called Hunch.com. We did taste prediction and recommendations. And until very, very recently, I was a principal scientist at eBay Research Labs, where I conducted research on brands and taste. And today, I'd like to tell you some data stories about taste by showing you some maps I made. So I'd like to begin by offering you a simple working definition of taste. So when you hear taste, you probably think taste for food on your palate. But taste is also a broader concept, as you know, which means your style, your preferences. Taste is a system of likes and dislike. It's an aesthetic system. But what's interesting about it is that it's based on the interconnections and how everything works together as a whole. You can have taste about food, or fashion, or wine, music, movies, books. And how do your tastes form? Well, I think this is a favorite subject of psychologists and sociologists. There are many factors, including your personality, childhood, education, and experiences. So the first time that I heard of taste, I think I was maybe in 6th grade, and I wasn't sure what to make of it, but someone told me that not everyone has taste. So that was discouraging. I didn't know if I would end up having taste. And I heard about this idea of highbrow versus lowbrow taste. Now, highbrow taste being what the cultural elites had, and lowbrow taste being what the working class had. So this is a chart from Life magazine, 1949. American society in that era saw taste as simply an extension of social class. So this is what they depicted. As you see here, highbrow man likes Eames chairs, he likes the ballet, and he owns a decanter for wine. While lowbrow man wears some country clothes, likes mail-order furniture that's really overstuffed chairs, and watches Western movies and eats coleslaw. So, I'm glad you're laughing. This way of understanding taste is full of stereotypes, but there's still something very fascinating and alluring about this chart for me, because it shows that taste is not just about one thing like food or wine. It is a panopticon. Taste is about everything. It is a dimension of everyday life. It applies to everything. Too bad this chart was made up by one person, but what if we could survey thousands of people in the society and then analyze their actual tastes? Well, someone did this. It wasn't me. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu did this. Bourdieu was a scholar of taste, a preeminent scholar of taste, and this chart was one that was built by him in this book called Distinction, and he used lifestyle surveys such as the famous Kodak survey of French society in the 1960s. He used math to turn survey data into maps. Bourdieu was a sociologist, but he was also one of the first social data scientists of the modern age. He helped to pioneer the use of a statistical technique that was used to generate this map. It's called multiple correspondence analysis. And I think what's remarkable, beyond how cool these maps were, was that its MCA, multiple correspondence analysis, is a powerful algorithm that's a predecessor to the very, very fancy machine learning algorithms that you still see today. So this approach is powerful because when you lay the survey data in proximity to each other, to me, it's a form of psychoanalysis about society. In this map of taste, what's revealed are patterns. For example, Renoir and Edith Piaf appear close together. But why? These maps illustrate and illuminate that there are many hidden stories to tell about why people like something and like things in conjunction to each other. Bourdieu's work raised many important questions. His conclusion was that taste is deeply linked to class and class warfare. And my PhD research, I wanted to know, is that still true? For example, in today's society, is taste primarily an extension of social class? But before I do that, I would like to play a game with you, because it is still early. And I will ask you to choose between two things and ask you to raise your hands. And hopefully I can predict something about you live, if I'm lucky. Fair warning, I've never tried this with a Swedish audience or a non-American audience. So it may not work. That'll be fun too. Okay, so everyone raise your hand. Okay, that's pretty good. So put it down. This is what scientists call a control, right? Okay. So make sure to look around to make sure your neighbors don't change votes. Okay, so there's two types of lettuce. You're eating a salad, and you have the choice between an arugula salad and an iceberg salad. How many people choose arugula? Hands down. How many people choose iceberg? Okay, hands down. So if you chose arugula, you're statistically likely to have liberal political leanings. And if you chose iceberg, you're not necessarily conservative, but you could be middle of the road, but you're not liberal. Okay, peanut butter. Do you love peanut butter? How many people love peanut butter? Okay, hands down. I know this is Sweden. And I had a Swedish friend tell me that this peanut butter is not so much a thing. But peanut butter, if you like peanut butter, it means you're personally conservative, as in you tend to take a lot of care over how you present yourself to others. Okay, so if you had to eat peanut butter, smooth or crunchy? Smooth, show of hands. Okay, hands down. Crunchy. Okay, so there's a lot of crunchy here. So what's interesting is smooth is the more conservative, personally conservative, and crunchy is the more personally liberal. Now you might ask, isn't there some cancellation? What if you like peanut butter, but you like crunchy peanut butter? This is purely anecdotally, not backed by data, but I noticed that a lot of people present themselves traditionally and carefully, and then once they get to know someone, then they sort of explode and let loose. So, do you like to dance? Hands up, hands down. Don't like to dance. Okay, so these are the PC people who don't like to dance. And everyone else is a Mac person, would be happy switching to a Mac. Brought to you by. Okay, would you drink from a public drinking fountain? Raise your hand. Okay, hands down. I'm not going to make the other people raise their hands, because this is a little bit of an indictment. If you are willing to drink from a public drinking fountain, it means you're willing to potentially risk your life to save a stranger. It doesn't mean anything the other way, so let's just move on. So from 2007 to 2011, I was a chief scientist of a startup called Hunch.com. In 2011, we were acquired by eBay and became like the eBay algorithmic merchandising team. Hunch.com was a great site. I thought so. We asked users to answer multiple choice questions about themselves so that we could learn about their tastes. Then we constructed models of their tastes. And then we used these models to recommend music, books, restaurants, where to go on vacation, things that they would love. You can think of it as something like a Netflix for anything. We were just a startup, but the data we collected was extraordinary. It's easily one of the largest lifestyle surveys ever conducted. So what kind of questions did we ask? We asked demographic questions, personality, are you a perfectionist, optimist, style, media, and habits. Do you own a goldfish? How many times do you hit snooze? Questions like what I asked you. And these were user-contributed questions. So users built up a corpus of 2,000 questions to ask. We collected 80 million answers, and that was about 110 answers per registered user, and we had some unregistered users too. And then we also let users rate items like books and restaurants, video games, and we had 15 million item ratings. So you throw this into factor analysis, something similar to what Bourdieu used, maybe an update and on steroids. And you get lots of hidden patterns of taste that emerge from this, and some unexpected correlations, like some of the ones I showed you, were in there. So one of the interesting things is that taste is contagious. I mean, if you follow certain people, that you're more likely to have a homophily relationship with them. So what we did was we took the hunch graph and we extended it with the Twitter graph and the Facebook graph. And this way we were able to have a guesstimate about 500 million people, 200 million items, and this graph was 30 billion edges. So we ended up making something like a GPS for taste. So a GPS, anywhere on Earth, a latitude and longitude, I can locate you. But taste space is a little more complicated. It's, I think, for a good approximation, you need 50 coordinates to put someone in taste space. But once you do, you can now measure any other person or any restaurant or any other thought. So you can create, and you can also guide people to things that they'll love. So what are the dimensions of this space? So we did the factor analysis, and a lot of interesting things surfaced. This is very much a function of the data and the run, but for this particular run, gender is important, but also a lot of personality considerations, things that you might see in Myers-Briggs or Big Five personality model, and very, very interesting. So I wanted to rewind a little bit and go back to the Media Lab, because in my early days at the MIT Media Lab, I was a grad student in 2002. I was in a research group called Counterintelligence. This was not spycraft. It was just a kitchen counter. And we worked with food data. We wanted to teach computers about food. I worked with a marvelous culinary historian at Harvard who had, through her life's work, built a database of cooking that, for over 10 years, she put together. And it was 10 megabytes. So 10 megabytes was the start of the big data that I was working with at the time. It was a starting point. We tried things. This was the Media Lab, so we did some crazy things. We measured fragrances of spices using electronic nose. It was like $100,000 to create digital fingerprints. We pointed cameras at food encyclopedias to absorb the knowledge of it, because you couldn't access a lot of those things digitally. We built crawlers and scrapers to scrape the internet for millions of recipes. And so the data that we assembled represented a wealth of information about food, and about flavors and ingredients and many, many relationships. So I wrote programs to visualize these maps. Here's one of my favorite maps. It captures the implied relationships between food ingredients. So the axes on this, like in Bourdieu, are not predetermined. They emerge out of the data. Once you interpret the pattern, it can be quite elegant. So from bottom to top, the vertical axis orders food, roughly speaking, from sweet to dry and bitter. And along the horizontal axis, from right to left, foods go from aromatic, like basil and fennel and dill, to, in the middle, mouthfeel, things that you experience in your mouth. And to the left side, linger, things like foie gras that kind of stay with you. And I think what's interesting is that the combined knowledge base that we had put together, millions of recipes, culinary databases, here was the algorithm giving us a summary, a cliff notes of what's important about food and what food means to us and our culture. What matters is this: an ingredient is sweet, semi-sweet, or dry, and some ingredients hit you in the nose, some hit you in the mouth, and some do their magic after you've already swallowed. So from this point on, I was rather addicted to uncovering these stories of taste. Now wine. So how many of you have done a wine tasting? OK. So your notes may not look like this. But wine tasting is very interesting because it's the interaction, it's the interface between how I experience a wine, and I put it into words. And so When you are buying a wine or you're going to a wine tasting, you have these notes. We managed to scrape and collect about 50,000 of these notes to see what we could learn about wine and how people were perceiving wine. As it turns out, there are a lot of similarities between this one and the food map. So here are grape varietals, and there's a simple semantics here: sweet, semi-sweet, and dry. This is roughly speaking. And from top to bottom, full-bodied, medium-body, and light-body. This is just of the grape. So Burgundy, for example, might be there because there are both white and red Burgundies, and the average of them places it lower. So one thing that you don't see here is the inertia on the axes, which is what that's saying is that between the x-axis and the y-axis, the knowledge captured in these differences between sweet and body accounts for about 50% of all the variation of wine. That means all the other things you think about the complexity of wine, that all has to fit in the other 50%. So wine is actually quite a compact space with two very, very important factors and then a lot of nuances that are packed together. So what can you do with something like this if we were to build a map? One thing we did was we could automatically generate tasting notes. So you give it a grape, and you give it a source of provenance, and it'll say that a Chardonnay from Australia is generally notably figgy, toast, butterscotch. A Shiraz from Australia would be cinnamon, peppery, berry. All right. So how many of you eat candy? This is okay. So remember that just when I talk about this, like you think sweet. If you like sweet foods, that means you eat a lot of candy versus you eat candy sometimes. So for my PhD research, I broadened away from food and wine to taste for music and TV shows, books. The maps shown here are generated from MySpace. How many of you were on MySpace? Remember that? Okay, not too many. But that was a social network as a predecessor to things like Facebook. And these maps describe the taste of the space of music on the left and on the right of television, books, and just media in general. What's interesting is, again, the most two important dimensions are shown here. And the first dimension is kind of curious because you have all these bands on the right, and then on the left you have rap and rock. What turns out that MySpace as a community really cared about specificity. They were, hipsters, they were very insistent, and if you just said in your musical interest, I like rap, I like rock, you sort of were in a different bucket. So this technique is revealing some of the priorities of the community. And then from top to bottom, dry to sweet, again, roughly. Kind of interesting. This is interpretive, right? So, and then on the right, another dimension that is recurring in a lot of things is liberal to conservative, like my parlor game with you guys. And top to bottom, again, you can make an argument, Maroon 5, Finding Nemo, Grey's Anatomy, like sweet, like sugary, almost sugary interests. So we did an experiment using Hunch data, and in Hunch, we actually ask about people's dietary preferences. Do you like sweet over sour? Do you love dessert? How often do you eat dessert? Do you eat dessert every day? So people's palates vary on this scale. So very high is sweet tooth, very, very sweet tooth. Low is like, not really, sugar not really for me. So what's interesting is you can now plot soda recommendations or preferences. People who have a sweet tooth, they'd like to drink things like Mountain Dew and Coca-Cola Cherry. Whereas if you don't have a sweet tooth, you prefer San Pellegrino or ginger beer. Same thing works for wine. So it turns out if you know that someone has a sweet tooth, they also tend to like sweeter grapes, like Muscat and Pinot Gris. And if the converse for dry, if you have a dry palate. The same thing works, the correlation holds for for music and for everything else. So Maroon 5, there it is. My arch nemesis, the Sweet Tooth Band. Here verified as liked by people with a sweet tooth. Versus at the bottom, Pavement, Jane's Addiction. That's all right stuff. I like that. Fashion, too. So sweet tooths like Dolce & Gabbana, Oscar de la Renta, and people who are more dry, Michael Kors, Ferragamo, Diane von Furstenberg. You're laughing because it's right? Works for baby girl names. So if you have a sweet tooth, you might name your baby girl Madeline. And if you don't like sugar, you might, may I recommend Avery or Zoe? Yeah. So moving on, so I landed at eBay through a hunch, and I fell in love with the data. The data is amazing, and eBay is, I think, one of the largest branded marketplaces there is. And brands are very, very special to me because just like Marshall McLuhan noted that what later became the internet that he talked about a lot, he said that the media and the internet, things like that, were extensions of the consciousness. I think of brands as extension of your taste. They're the physical manifestations of your taste in society. So using eBay data, we're able to look at co-purchase behavior and co-browse behavior just to see were there any themes that emerge? Like, are there correlations between brands? Do brands correlate with each other purely by price point? Or do they correlate, as I had hoped and believed, by a taste factor? Do they cluster by taste? So here you see Alexander Wang, and that's a fashion designer. And then you see other fashion designers that orbit Alexander Wang or are correlated using co-purchase data. There's Acne, Our Legacy, not too far away. So I made a map. And this is of all the major notable fashion designers in the eBay universe. And so you have lots of interesting, you call them taste neighborhoods, because that's kind of what they are. So here you have Brooks Brothers and Zegna, and these are really sort of formal menswear designers. Over here, now we take the highway over here, and you get to formal women's wear. Judith Lieber, Ungaro, Valentino. You go up a little bit, and now there's some mainstream luxury designers, Stella McCartney, Thakun, Jason Wu. Over here, you have Kate Spade, Tory Burch. These are younger, feminine lifestyle designers. Over here are the more emerging, cutting-edge luxury designers for women, Jerome Dreyfus, Rag & Bone, Alexander Wang. Over here, you have, I think this is one of my favorite clusters because there's a trend a few years ago called Americana. It has to do with vintage and heritage. And so that features Gitman. Our Legacy is interestingly in there. Band of Outsiders. And finally over here, men's emerging cutting-edge designers. There's a bunch of Japanese designers in there. Rick Owens, Christopher Kane, Boris Bijan Sabiri. You can make the same map in other domains where brand matters. And so here we're looking at small kitchen appliances brands. So here you have the Ginsu knife and the NutriBullet, the Magic Bullet. They're sort of made for TV infomercial brands. Here, George Foreman Grill, Zoji Rushi, SodaStream. These are sort of the upscale lifestyle. So previous to showing you this, I had looked at the loadings to see what it means. Otherwise, it'd be kind of hard to just interpret that. Over here, there's a large espresso culture, and here you have tons of brands that form an ecosystem of brands around espresso, really kind of moving from just coffee machines to lifestyle extensions. So let's look more at espresso machines, coffee machines. So here are 4 coffee machine brands, and underneath are the correlated watch brands. So it turns out if you like or have bought or engaged with that coffee machine brand, you'll probably like those watch brands. And so I'm not super into watches, but I've worked with some folks that were really into watches, and they told me what the pattern here was, which is that these are engineering oriented. Those watches are, they may be like wearing a BMW on your wrist. And these are more personality focused. If you look at the marketing campaigns, they're really about color and vivaciousness and lifestyle and friendship and a lot of smiles. And then somewhere in the middle, the interface of engineering personality, you see a lot of brands that talk about style and being stylish. I think this is a really interesting mode of analysis. It harkens back to the Life magazine chart, right, where if you have this kind of taste, then you'll like these things in these different categories. But here, we're not doing highbrow, lowbrow. These are just actually quite democratic. We're just making observations about patterns that people have expressed through their purchase data. So brands aren't static. They don't always mean the same thing from one month to the next, from 1 year to the next. So here are some fashion brands and roughly their growth trajectories in sales. And everyone wants to grow from the lower left to the upper right forever. But that doesn't always happen. Some brands take a turn. So there's how many of you know the diffusion of innovations curve that is shown here? Okay, so this curve shows, it's a theory, and it's been tested in communications theory, about how innovations tend to spread and adoption spread. And it hits early adopters first, then early majority, late majority, and laggards. And what's interesting about this is that every brand has this curve. And I think of many of the top brands, the brands that came out of nowhere and grew into huge successes over the years, I think of those as innovations. So we're going to go ahead and model those as innovations. And we're going to use this to predict brand health. Is your brand going to continue to grow to the upper right? And what's important here is there's 2 groups of people we want to monitor. The first group are people who are statistically early. They tend to be innovators or be close to innovators. They tend to invest time and effort. They're the first to know about a brand. They're sort of psychic. They have foresight. They know about something before the trend actually happens. And then there are folks that are statistically later. They're more casual participants. Sometimes they're the last to know, and they do sometimes participate in fads. So if we can build a model of these 2 groups of users, we can start to build a model of the health of a brand. So here's an unhealthy brand, not to be named. And the chart shows months since January 2010. And you can see sales grows, and then it declines. So you don't want that to happen. So here is maybe the internals of the marketplace. Here it's showing just the activity level of early adopters, statistically early adopters, and statistically late adopters in that brand. What's interesting to notice is that the late adopters tends to grow very quickly around month 12, month 13, but this precedes the sales peak by like a full year. So it's something, the internals aren't looking right. There's it's not that the early adopter crowd is churning out of the brand, the late adopter crowd is churning into the brand. So here's a healthy brand. And here, again, the early adopters, it's declining, but that's okay. That doesn't seem to have as much an effect on things. It doesn't precipitate collapse in the hundreds of brands that we look through. But what is interesting to note here is that the late adopters are cycling into this brand slowly and gradually. And so that's something we've shown here is that rate of adoption of late adopters, that really, really matters. So we don't have too much time, but I'd like to just review the things that we walk through. So number one, to understand taste, if you want to understand your friend's taste, your family's taste, or taste in general, I propose to you that sugar matters. Sugar content really, really matters. And maybe this is why we call it taste, because it's a metaphor. And I haven't looked at it, but I'm sure there's the measurement of acid or bitter brands, and taste in the mouth and taste in our life, they're really connected. Number two, by clustering brands, taste neighborhoods, they emerge. And I'm reminded of the Mappa Mundis in the medieval times when we made maps of the world that were incomplete. And I think these maps of identity space, taste space, these are the new maps that we're making, and they're charting new frontiers of identity. Just incidentally, about 5 years ago, my favorite brands were the ones boxed in blue. And in the past 2 years, they're the ones in red. And it's almost like I picked up and moved. That's what it feels like. But it's interesting is that I discovered all of those brands, not in a connected way, not using these maps, but purely through serendipity. But I am unique, just like everyone else. Number three, brand coolness is controlled by late adopters. People talk a lot about the rate of adoption as being important. I would say we found that rate of adoption is very important, and the controlling factor seems to be the rate of adoption of statistically late adopters. That matters a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo. Super interesting. Before I invite our editors here to ask questions from social media, I just have a question regarding is there a way that brands can control how quickly late adopters adopt your brand or get into start using your service? Or
that's a really good question. Yeah. I don't have some pearls of wisdom to give you here,
right.
But I do think that in light of this research, we might think about promotions and dissemination through media outlets a little bit differently, and at least factor the rate of growth into a brand and not just trying to hit sales numbers.
Okay, cool. All right. Katarina, Ada, Mats, do we have any interesting comments?
Yeah, people are very enthusiastic about this. And I can't help but wonder, when you meet someone, do you look at what they're wearing and what they're drinking, and then you know everything about them? Or?
Yes.
Oh, so you know that then. Well, I think the most common comment is that, okay, well, this applies for me, but this doesn't really apply to me. I mean, people are more complicated than that, even though, you like both chunky and smooth peanut butter.
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so these are just, one-off correlations, and it's statistics, so they're always right some of the time and wrong some of the time. If it was always right, it would not be statistics, it'd just be truth. But our approach generally at Hunch was to knit together many different statistical signals to create a composite signal that would be of higher predictive value.
Right. And also, my last question is there a danger that we get stuck inside one taste bubble because we only get marketing for the kind of bubble people that we are?
Sorry?
We stay in the same bubble because the only marketing we get is for what we're supposed to like, and we never reach outside of that brand. Is there a risk involved in that?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but the idea of a filter bubble or information bubble applying to taste. I think that's very true because we are the subject of so much marketing. We generate so much data in terms of click data and click trails that we're portraying ourselves, and then we're being advertised against that data. And it's a stereotype that may or may not represent us. That's an interesting point, and I hadn't thought much about it. Thank you.
Cool. Anything else?
I was thinking about the taste of Webbdagarna?
Well, I'll owe you guys a map.